Hello and welcome to Energy Unplugged by Aurora. This podcast features various experts from Aurora having in-depth conversations with key industry leaders, policymakers and academics from all over the world. It explores the hottest topics across the energy market and gives a unique perspective on major energy issues.
Hello and welcome to another episode of Energy Unplugged. I'm Pierre Denery, Head of France for Aurora Energy Research. And with me today is Thekla von Bülow, who is Aurora's Head of Advisory in Europe. And we're also delighted to welcome Pascale Courcelle from Bpifrance to today's episode. Hello, Pascale.
Bonjour, Pierre.
So, Pascale, you started your career as an underwriting account manager in Brittany. And after that, you went to the credit committee of the bank's head office, where you specialize in property financing for companies in the Ile de France region. And so when Bpifrance was actually created in 2012, you had already joined the renewable energy project financing teams. In 2017, you were appointed director of real estate and energy environment financing at Bpi. And so that allowed you to use the full scope of your skills acquired over the past 25 years in those type of projects, where I would say your preferred subjects are development of renewable energies, energy efficiency in buildings, greening of industry, and more globally, transition of businesses under Bpifrance climate plan. Just to mention, you're also the vice president of the Financial Lease Commission, the ASF in French, an association that leads the community of financial leases from banking groups. And finally, you are behind the creation of the Renewable Electricity Guarantee Fund, which will be the subject of our discussion today.
Thank you, Pierre, and hello also from my side, Pascale. Today's podcast episode will focus on the GER, the Renewable Electricity Guarantee, which is a guarantee fund for PPAs, so which means power purchase agreements, which was launched in France on the 1st of September 2023. So we'll be asking a couple of questions about how the fund works, but also put it into the European perspective. We'll look at examples of similar funds in Europe, and we'll talk about how the fund will help to boost the French market for renewable energy. I'd like to start by asking a question for our non-French listeners. Perhaps you could tell us a bit about Bpifrance, and perhaps in a few figures, and what role it plays in implementing France's energy and climate strategy.
Bpifrance est une banque publique d'investissement qui vient de fêter ses 10 ans, mais elle est le fruit de
Bpifrance is a public investment bank that's just celebrated its 10th anniversary, but it's really the fruit of a large number of groups with historic know-how and roots in multiple regions with a mission to serve the future. It has a number of business lines that it's involved in, including equity investment, bank credit guarantees, investment finance, and innovation and export financing, and last but not least, advisory and support services. But all of these are within a particular focus of the energy transition. So really, it's a unique role. And all of these business lines are organized throughout the company to offer a wide range of resources and services to our clients. So we have to be a trusted partner, as we are a tool of the state at the service of businesses, and our position in the financing of renewable energy starts really from the French region itself. It's been built at the same time as the renewable energy sector, and as such, we align our development with the needs of our customers, both in terms of the amount of intervention, but also in terms of product line and structuring of debt, as this applies in France since the beginning of 2023, and in Europe for all of our French customers.
All right, that's very clear. So in concrete terms, what are the areas and methods of intervention by the BPI in the energy sector today?
Alors, pour résumer, nous intervenons sur
So to summarize, we're involved in the sector in 4 main areas. The first is equity investment. So we're involved at a company level in groups of renewable energy producers with different types of funds, depending on the type of company or the size of its operation. And we're currently involved in a number of fundraisings on the market to support the development of our customers. Secondly is the financing of innovation with a particular variety of products that we're interested in. So, for example, subsidies and loans, and the ones that I manage personally are the financing of renewable energy projects, but also in the environmental sector, looking at things like energy from waste. So these are project financing, senior debt structure that's structured on the basis of DSCR ratios, which after the validation of production audits and project contracts enable debt to really be implemented. So our outstanding balance or place in the sector is quite substantial and amounts to 8 billion euros. So this is really a large amount of debt. And every year we support new project financing operations at a rate of around 1.5 billion euros.
Nouvelles opérations de financement de projet.
Yeah, in fact, you're perhaps the leading debt financier in France for renewable energies today.
Probablement, en tout cas, en termes d'enveloppe.
Yeah, I think it's fairly clear that this is the case, at least in terms of open debt, as we do very few syndications, and perhaps on the average year, of course, depending on the year, we're typically the leader in this space. And then the last activity is really the creation of this GER fund, which guarantees renewable electricity against the default of industrial buyers under corporate PPAs. But I think we're going to discuss this in more detail.
Could you perhaps start by explaining to us, let's say at a high level, in general terms, what the fund is and what it aims to achieve? Perhaps also start by telling us how the project came about.
So at the end of 2022, the French government entrusted Bpifrance with the implementation of a guarantee fund, which is designed to encourage industrial companies to sign long-term contracts for the procurement of electricity from renewable energy sources. In reality, this mission was carried out by a working group set up in 2021 and led by the Directorate General of Enterprise, which is part of our Ministry of Economy. So the mechanism for issuing guarantees is a major activity here at Bpifrance, and I've given a fairly broad overview, but we manage funds on behalf of the state, aiming at guaranteeing the delivery of multiple bank credits to act against company malfunctions. So really, BPI aims to ensure the guarantee of producers as opposed to banks.
Interesting. PPAs are, in the end, a direct electricity contract between producers and buyers. So a fund like that can actually benefit the market by giving more buyers access to the French PPA market, which in reality is really still in its infancy. So perhaps you could explain a little more about which parties the fund can or will benefit, and above all, what the selection criteria are for the buyers. How will BPI really assess which producers and projects should benefit from the fund?
For the first time, the guarantee that we're issuing is not for banks, but rather for producers who will be the beneficiaries of this specific guarantee. These will be producers of new installations, and it's important to have this character of new installations that will be solar or wind powered, including the repowering in mainland France. Producers who are beneficiaries, and we are going to guarantee the default of industrial buyers. So industrial here is defined in the French nomenclature for really being focused on the manufacturing processes and extractive activities known as the BEC nomenclature. So it's very precise. And it's just the notion of an industry or a company that manufactures. So we're going to be able to guarantee this default by buyers for the duration of the CPPA up to a limit of 25 years, which is an extremely long period. The coverage will be at 80% of the PPA price, and there is a guaranteed annual volume of at least 10 gigawatt hours under the CPPA contract. This is not the volume consumed by the industrial company per se, but rather the minimum guaranteed volume under the PPA contract. And this is a request made by the state. Just like the limitation of eligibility to industrial customers has been requested by the state. And so the default linked to several unpaid debts will be materialized by the producer and by the notification of the resignation of the contract by the producers to the buyer. So to summarize, there's really three important pieces of criteria. The first being that the installations must be new solar or wind power plants. Secondly, that the purchasers must be industrial companies that sit within the definition of the French nomenclature, and that there must be a minimum guaranteed production or annual volume of 10 gigawatt hours. And these are three very objective criteria. Additionally, eligible buyers must also have a Bpifrance rating, since this is the rating that is shared by the greatest number of companies. So it's not necessary to use a different rating agency that's not used by all companies. And this rating must be between 1 and 6+, which is a jargon that's known by lenders. For eligible startups that are industrial, they will also have access, and at that point, it will be an internal rating that will be used by BPI. So as you can see, these are fairly simple legibility criteria.
Vous voyez, ce sont des critères assez simples d'éligibilité.
Yeah, thank you. I think this latter category is actually quite interesting, because especially for new industry sectors such as hydrogen, those usually don't have sufficient creditworthiness or proof of concept to close a PPA, and a fund like this can really help producers to get access to the market.
Exactement, voilà.
Exactly, and that's what we're really aiming for, and also what we want, without this number being too large in terms of the fund, because we also need a certain amount of robustness in terms of the diversity of players within the fund.
Au titre du fonds.
And perhaps just to clarify for our listeners, when you said that the Banque de France counts between 1 and 6+, I have to say 6+ is actually quite broad. So it goes right up to consumers who are considered risky in other respects.
Exactement. La note 1 est bien sûr
Exactly.
très bonne.
So a rating of 1 is, of course, a very good rating. 6+ is a company that is already in somewhat of a complex situation, bearing in mind that a rating of 7 is typically the notion of a company in difficulty. So 6+ is really just a little bit before that. So the spectrum is extremely broad, and we'll see that it's in the interest of all companies to apply for this guarantee, whether they're rated 1 or 6+, because it's also fundamentally important in terms of their own relationships
Dans
with
la
the producer.
relation avec le producteur.
Very interesting. And you said that 80% of the price is guaranteed. So my next question is, how exactly is the price calculated?
Alors, le prix,
So the price is ultimately a tailor-made price, as it will correspond to the analysis of each individual project for each counterparty that is proposed. So first of all, there are parameters that I would say are more mandatory to take into account that are linked to the project itself and to the underlying asset that will enable the electricity to be delivered. There's the type of energy source being developed, so for example, solar or wind, and the duration of the contract, the price of the PPA itself, which is also a key factor, and the guaranteed annual volume, which can vary year to year and even month to month, as we don't generate the same amount of electricity in July as we do, say, in January. There's also the delivery date to determine the actual construction period, and then there are optional parameters. So say, for example, the producer and his lender want to consider that there may be market floors, so above zero. There may also be a waiting period, for example, a period during which the compensation cannot be paid even if the buyer defaults. So it can be interesting for counterparties with good ratings to consider that they have the visibility over a shorter period. So say, for example, 3 to 5 years, and that they don't need to be covered by the guarantee for these first few years, which will lower the price. Once we have these mandatory parameters and a few optional ones, there are other parameters linked to the counterparty themselves. So we're going to take into account its Banque de France rating, and thanks to a partnership with Aurora, we'll be adding a market price curve analysis. So every quarter we receive these price curves for the sectors, and then we also rework them in a conservative manner, as lenders typically do. And all these elements ultimately enable us to determine the accumulated risk, both of the company defaulting and at the same time, if this default occurs, the market price risk. This enables us to define a fee expressed in euros, which will be an annual commission covering the cost of capital, the cost of risk, and the cost of management for the fund and for Bpifrance. And this commission will be paid from the moment the guarantee contract, which is a tripartite contract between the producer, buyer, and Bpifrance, is signed. It's payable by the buyer, and it's therefore payable annually on the anniversary date. However, it will be digressive to some extent because it must first serve the cost of capital, but it can also be expressed in euros by the average per megawatt hour. So depending on the scenario, you can have it be anywhere between 1 to 5 euros. It's really going to be quite variable. So it's not something that should be taken as fixed. So it's really a tailor-made job that each project will have its own guarantee cost depending on all the parameters I've just defined.
Okay, thank you, Pascale, for this detailed explanation. So with this guarantee, the projects will be able to finance themselves with non-recourse finance, and therefore ultimately be less expensive. Perhaps if we look at the start of the fund's activity, the first PPA was signed between Arcolia and Bonduelle. So Arcolia is a French developer, and Bonduelle is a food and beverage company in France. This PPA was signed in September of 2023 when the fund was launched. Currently, how many guarantees do you have on the table, and how many PPAs do you think you'll be able to cover over the next 3 years? In terms of initial endowment, do you think it will be sufficient to cover the demand that you are seeing?
So first of all, we're really proud to sign the first deal just 1 month after the official launch. But it has to be said that negotiations actually started a few months beforehand when the fund was being designed. We had carried out what we call market tests with buyers and producers, and we had this case study which enabled us to quickly sign this first deal. It's also important to remember that there's always a very long negotiation period between the producer and the corporate off-taker itself. So it's important to anticipate the inclusion of the guarantee in this process. And this is what many producers and manufacturers are doing. And they are now approaching us at a very early stage. So we have quite a large number of requests, but they will probably end up in official issuances when the final financing needs arise. So it's difficult to forecast volumes, but we already have about 10 quotes in progress. And we've responded to requests from both industrial companies and producers. And thanks to this mechanism, they can continue their own analysis in the financing or subscription of this contract. I should also point out that this will also interfere with the financing of lenders, since the fund will compensate 80% of the PPA price. So we're really obliged to limit ourselves to 80% of the PPA, because this is one of the criteria for not classifying a guarantee as state aid. And it's depending on this that we'll be able to include industrial companies who are naturally less eligible for project financing. So are we going to have enough? For the moment, I think everything's fine. There's room for everyone, and I hope the fund will be successful. We have an endowment of up to 500 megawatts, so there's still plenty of scope for new projects.
Well, let's say 10 applications to lease PPAs is actually a lot for a fund that just started recently, but maybe not that much if you compare with other markets, with European markets in particular. What we see here at Aurora is that the French market is still a little underdeveloped compared to our neighbors, particularly in terms of supply. So how do you explain this situation?
Well,
I'd say it's been a fairly slow start, but in the end, you have to understand where we're coming from. So France has introduced very strong support mechanisms, a form of subsidized tariffs known as open bids or competitive tenders. And these support mechanisms have enabled developers, producers, investors, and lenders to regard the EDF feed-in tariff as a state guarantee over 15 or 20 years. So in this way, the project financing model has been secured with DSCR ratios and has made it possible to achieve large volumes to launch the sector. So from the developer's point of view, they have no incentive to sign PPAs so long as the support mechanism ensures the profitability of these projects and volumes. So additionally, debt structuring would have been less optimal if there would have been a gearing problem without the additional security of the guarantee on a private buyer. In addition to this, project financing by banks, as practiced in France, is very competitive, and it really secures financing for all developers because interest rates are secured. So with such security of rate and financing, why go looking for a counterpart offer other than that of the state? And from the buyer's perspective, France's energy mix is already very decarbonized, so the low price of electricity just isn't justifying paying more. However, over the last year, with the crisis, the inflation of capex, and the rise in interest rates, this really opened up a way for corporate PPAs to seek a better return on the capital invested on the producer side. So the first CPPA concepts were signed, for example, at the end of purchase obligation contracts, where there was no debt servicing at stake. The first players to buy those PPAs were investment grade, in an effort to lead by example. And in the end, it was something more affordable, easier for both producers and lenders. And now we can see that it is, I would say at least, becoming a more democratic way, and that this guarantee can ultimately help give access to more people. Personally, I think the market was a long way behind in France, but it's now accelerated quite quickly, as it can be seen from all the public declarations, signatures, and all the expressions of interest that we're receiving, either for CPPAs or for the signature of this guarantee.
Yes, thank you, Pascale. I completely agree. Over the last few months, we've seen not just in France, but in many European countries, a real increase in the interest shown by corporates in signing PPAs, not just to access GOs, but also for a long-term hedge. We also already touched upon the European context a little bit. So let's take a closer look at how France compares with the other countries. So for example, with regards to funds in the European context, there are two countries which already have set up PPA funds, which is Spain and Norway. In Spain, for example, I think the fund was set up in 2021, and we saw a significant growth in corporate PPAs after the introduction. Norway is a much more mature countries in terms of PPAs, and there the guarantee fund is already very established. So perhaps you could give us a little compare and contrast between the French and the other two funds.
Yeah, that is true that when we designed the fund, we looked at what has happened in Europe. We looked at the mechanics of this Norwegian fund and the mechanics of the Spanish fund. And I would say that there is little difference in the criteria, but the major difference is the compensation mechanism. So in Norway, the fund was set up in 2011 and is managed by Efskin, which is a government-owned financial company with its origins in the export guarantee sector. And the Norwegian scheme provides a physical PPA, and we do that as well, but also a financial PPA with no distinction based on location or technology. So the funds are very similar in terms of eligible manufacturers, guaranteed volume and duration. We also have industrial companies. We have a 10 gigawatt hours and we have up to 25 years. And there is an additional option, which is to reimburse the banks directly for their loans that relate to these electricity sale contracts. But this option, as I understand, has not been activated by the operators. In France, we only take physical CPPAs because we also want to create additionality across the territory, which was a desire of the state, and because it's also been a market practice up until then. So the main difference, I would say, when the guarantee is activated is that, to put simply, the Norwegian fund guarantees 80% of the PPA price as well. But when the market is higher than this price, the fund is topped up with a surplus. Now, when we created and analyzed the design of this fund, it also had to fit into a legal, accounting, and tax definition specific to the business that we were in, the banking business. So in order to remain within this banking activity and within the definition of a bank guarantee, the fund must focus strictly on indemnifying. It must not receive resources to compensate. And so we have to treat this market surplus differently. So our mechanism, the surpluses received by the market in excess of 80% of this PPA are calculated in a notional reserve, which remains with the producer and ultimately is analyzed as a credit balance. Before seeking compensation from the fund, we first draw from this notional reserve, and if the market has not been able to provide sufficient remuneration during the compensation period in question. So it's really quite a different mechanism, but because we had to respond to a more strict banking definition of constraints from kind of strict legal, accounting, and tax definitions, it's very important to understand this choice. And I think it also corresponds well to the expectations of producers to recover this surplus that the market could offer.
Que le marché pourrait offrir.
Okay, so it seems like it's a very specific design just for France and also in context of the EU. So a slightly different question. If we look at the neighboring countries, for instance, my own country, Germany, this is a rather undersupplied country in terms of PPAs. So we'll need a lot of PPAs potentially from other countries like France. So the French fund is currently explicitly limited to contracts between producers and consumers located in France. So the question is whether in the future you could foresee a cooperation more on a cross-border level.
Yes, I think it's pretty clear that today we are talking specifically about the French state endowment to cover up to 500 megawatts of projects. So it's really on the French territory in mainland France and for French manufacturers. So it's true that it's natural to focus exclusively on power stations in France and industries based there. Having said that, I think we can start cooperating by sharing expertise and experiences to create similar initiatives elsewhere. And if we wanted to think about something more European, it would be interesting to look at either the EIB or the European Commission itself to be able to have a European endowment and duplicate this model in some respects. But for the moment, I think that what will interest the parties is to have feedback on this fund and then to be able to capitalize on it and see how we can evolve this or create European copies of it.
Des copies européennes.
Yes, fully agree. And we've talked about Spain and Norway, but France is really the third country that has launched such a fund, and it has launched at a time when the EU has agreed to reform the European power markets, and that it would require member states to make it easier to sign PPAs. So do you think that our point of view neighbors, Germany, for example, will follow the French example, and have any of the neighboring countries been in touch to ask for your feedback or advice?
Alors, on a été sollicité.
Well, we have been asked for feedback on a very limited scale from the Netherlands, for example, to date. And we've prepared a presentation of this fund in English so that it can be more widely distributed. So it's likely that once we've signed, a significant number of contracts will be more closely observed and watched, and that will probably make people want to draw more inspiration, I guess, from us. So that's really it for the moment. It's brand new, and really it's like having a 3-month-old baby. It was designed almost less than 9 months ago, so it was a bit premature, you can say. And since we had a state order in November 2022, and we finished this almost at the end of July, it was quite a quick turnaround. So it's pretty fresh. But I think we're going to continue to be observed, and I hope that the success of this fund will really encourage other countries to look at how this can be set up within their own internal constraints and draw inspiration from what we've been able to do here.
S'inspirer de ce que nous avons pu faire.
Great. Then let's see if Germany will contact you, because I know Germany has plans to set up a fund too, but it's indeed quite early stage.
Thanks, Thekla. So actually, I mean, talking about Europe, the real idea behind the reform of the European electricity market is to give long-term visibility to buyers. And in particular, what is mentioned in the text is the development of PPAs as well as CFDs, those that we already know in France, contracts that are backed by the state, as you mentioned previously. In this regard, France seems to have won a battle over these CFDs, since it has been authorized to include nuclear power plants in the mechanisms. But in the end, the solution chosen a few weeks ago by the French government and EDF was to tax revenues in excess of 78 euros per megawatt hour to land at a final price of close to 70 euros per megawatt hour for consumers. For the moment, from what we've been able to see at Aurora, from what we hear in the market, buyers are not super satisfied about this. Firstly, because the mechanism doesn't give them sufficient visibility, and also because the price remains quite high, especially if you compare it with the previous ARENH mechanism, which gave consumers access to low-cost nuclear energy at 42 euros per megawatt hour. So do you think that the end of the ARENH and its replacement will encourage consumers to look for more PPAs?
So above all is that the end of the ARENH has created a real fear of the aftermath and doubt, I guess, about the balance of supply purchases on a buyer side. On the other hand, I think that the period of 50 euro electricity prices is behind us, or at least we won't be seeing it again very soon. So that's another aspect that needs to be taken into account. It creates uncertainty, particularly for the smaller customers, as to whether their supplier will be able to aggregate their basic supply with this renewable production. And it's not necessarily very visible. And these announcements are recent, and we also need to understand the mechanisms, how this will work in practice for operators. But from the moment we couple centralized energy from nuclear power with decentralized energy from renewable sources, we still have to think about the implications of this energy mix in terms of forecasting, flexibility, management, and value. So yes, I think that the energy mix is a good thing for buyers who can have these long-term contracts with secure prices and more flexible short and medium-term contracts, just as I think that it's also necessary for producers to continue to respond to calls for these tenders from the state with well-established specifications and mature financing, and at the same time to diversify their type of contract. So I guess it's really all about experimenting with a new type of negotiation. So not just over the counter, but also participating in the introduction of what I would call in energy that is decentralized and ultimately directly accessible to the end consumer. And we are more concerned with the user who will take ownership of the type of energy he wants to have. So I would say that the CPPA complements the existing short-term supply market structure with a long-term instrument, which makes it possible to limit the exposure of buyers to the volatility of energy prices. And because of this, it's essential for our economy to have these types of measures.
Ces dispositions.
Agreed, but in the end, PPA contracts are still relatively complex contracts. There are lots of clauses, and you have to take views on the future price of energy 15, 20 years from now. Today, I'd say large industrial companies with high consumptions level, they are able to sign those PPAs. They have the capabilities, but that's not necessarily the case for smaller players. So how can they protect themselves?
En effet, le déploiement des...
So you are right in that the rollout of CPPAs started with larger buyers with good ratings, these so-called investment-grade companies, who are offered a security of payment close to that offered by the state. And this fund provides new security for smaller buyers. And the aim is both to make project financing bankable on the producer side and for buyers whose solvency is not guaranteed beyond an average term of 5 to 7 years, so that they have access to security of supply and price. At Bpifrance, we've gained experience in this type of contract with various types of buyers, either mixed in a project finance portfolio with feed-in tariffs that enable risks to be mutualized or isolated in a project company with an appropriate guarantee. The guarantee fund is for the benefit of the producer, but you also have to bear in mind that this is beneficial to the buyer who doesn't use up bank lending. And that's important, and it's long-term security, the cost of which is defined well in advance, whereas a bank guarantee, what we call a GAPD, a guarantee on first demand, which is currently a proposed guarantee, which rather provides short-term security for a defined volume. But in the event of a non-renewal due to a proven default or due to higher costs, for example, the buyer will be threatened with the termination of the CPPA. So I would say that ultimately the fund is also a security of supply for the buyer. It's a security for the producer against default by the off-taker, but in providing a long-term guarantee, the off-taker also makes it less interesting for the producer to denounce the contract and replace him with another buyer. So it really provides security throughout the duration of the CPPA.
Tout au long de la durée du corporate PPA.
Extremely interesting, and probably not something that we have in mind directly, actually. We're coming to the end of this recording. I'd like to ask you one last question, which may be a bit open-ended. We talked earlier about the fact that the supply of PPAs in France was limited. We hope the fund will help to accelerate the development of PPAs, but beyond the creation of the fund, what do you think is going to foster that supply of PPA and make it possible to reach the level of expected demand?
Alors, je dirais qu'il y a deux limitations actuelles.
I would say that at the moment there are currently two limitations, namely the volume of the underlying projects and also the supply authorization that has to be obtained. So the limit to the supply of PPAs in France is also due to the lack of underlying projects because land has to be found. So developing a renewable energy project in France is subject to a wide range of regulations, including town planning, operation, impact studies, and grid connection. And these authorizations sometimes take a long time to obtain and are subject to appeal. So there's still a growing problem of acceptability or, public acceptance in France, which is now also affecting the solar PV sector. It's also necessary to create a local dialogue to get people on board with the project. And at the moment, I'd say that even if it doesn't correspond to these contracts, participative financing has been a key factor in improving solar public acceptance. And then the authorization deadlines, they need to be relaxed to speed up the CPPA process. So that's a very administrative, structural element of the French market. I would say the CPPA will also develop thanks to the agility of independent power producers. So Arcolia, which is the first, is an independent producer. We need to give a large number of producers access to these new purchasing contracts. Today, however, the regulatory provisions concerning the newly required authorization of supply for all producers who contract CPPAs could potentially slow down this deployment if we don't supervise the delegation option that they can obtain from existing suppliers. Suppliers should offer this delegation option unconditionally and at no extra cost. Otherwise, it can create a problem of competitiveness between these major players and the independent players. Then in terms of demand and how we can reach this level of demand, personally, I think that if producers need to move away from the kind of siloed approach they've adopted at the very start of the industry, they need to join forces with the industrial sector. Manufacturers need them, and renewable energy producers need manufacturers to negotiate new formats and to diversify their offer to buyers. So I think that if producers agree to work together with industrial companies, we'll see the emergence of more and more PPA contracts, because the whole economy in France will be boosted by these types of contracts and the deployment of renewable energy. And then we'll have the decarbonization of industrial companies, and the CSR policy of each of them will all be kind of ticked off and achieved, so to speak.
Bien coché.
Thank you very much, Pascale. It was really interesting. I wish you every success with the fund. It would be great to see how many projects the fund will support over the coming months and years. And what we've discussed today, I think, is that this fund is really an example that will surely be followed by other countries, with France really setting an example for other countries to follow, such as the Netherlands and Germany and so on. Pierre, any final thoughts?
Well, I have to say, I note that you have actually a much broader view on the issue of PPAs, not just the guarantee fund, and with perhaps a small message for the government, for the administration that you addressed towards the end of the interview. So in any case, once again, thank you very much for joining us today. It was a real pleasure to talk to you.
Merci beaucoup à tous les deux. J'étais très honorée. Merci beaucoup.
That was Pascale Courcelle from Bpifrance talking to Pierre Denery, Head of France for Aurora, and Thekla von Bülow, Aurora's co-head of Advisory Central Europe. Do keep an eye on our podcast feed for more in-depth conversations with senior members of the energy industry. The best way to do this is to subscribe on whatever platform you use. Thanks for listening, and goodbye.